The tragic story of the Shakahola cult massacre begins in the Kilifi region of southeastern Kenya. In early 2023, hundreds of followers of the Good News International Church, led by the charismatic pastor Paul Mackenzie and Thenge, gathered in the remote Shakahola forest. Mackenzie had promised his devotees a path to salvation. By starving themselves to death, they would meet Jesus and avoid damnation in the impending apocalypse he prophesied. But instead of divine deliverance, the faithful found only suffering and death. By the time authorities intervened in April 2023, a shocking 400-plus bodies had been exhumed from mass graves, with hundreds more followers still missing. The Shakahola cult massacre would become one of the worst tragedies caused by religious extremism in modern times. This is the chilling story of how one man's toxic ideology led hundreds to their graves. The rise of Paul Mackenzie's cult. Paul Mackenzie and Thenge seemed an unlikely cult leader. The former taxi driver founded the Good News International Church in 2003 in the coastal town of Malindi. His passionate sermons and charismatic style quickly drew a devoted following among the region's poor and uneducated population. But Mackenzie's teachings grew increasingly radical over the years. He preached that education was evil and demanded followers remove their children from school. He denounced modern medicine and government institutions as satanic. More bizarrely, Mackenzie eventually claimed that he was a prophet who spoke directly to God. Among others, 39-year-old Titus Katana, an ex-follower of the Kenyan cult leader, broke away from Mackenzie's church following the introduction of some of these increasingly intrusive and corrupted laws. His creed even began attracting police attention. Mackenzie was arrested in 2017 on charges of radicalization, but was later acquitted. By 2019, he was arrested again for possessing film material intended to incite hatred against practitioners of other religions, including Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam. Despite controversies surrounding his inflammatory rhetoric, his sermons continued to proliferate through his community and took on a more apocalyptic tone. With the church under more scrutiny from rights groups and authorities, an undeterred Mackenzie relocated with many of his followers to a plot of land he owned in the isolated Shakahola forest. There, far from prying eyes, Mackenzie's cult descended into full-blown religious extremism. He declared the Shakahola forest a holy land, and even dubbed it New Jerusalem. Adherents were told to cut all ties with the outside world, a world which Mackenzie deemed irredeemably corrupt. The settlement. Life in the Shakahola cult settlement was strictly regimented. The estimated 800 to 1,000 residents were separated into self-contained communities with biblical names like Judea, Bethlehem, Galilee, Samaria, Capernaum, Emmaus, and Nazareth. Cult members were compelled to surrender all their possessions and subsist communally off the land. Modern clothing was prohibited in favor of simple robes. Communication with all outsiders, including family, was forbidden. Mackenzie himself lived in a large compound in Judea containing 3 houses and a gazebo, where he would hold meetings with church officials. Armed thugs helped Mackenzie exert control over his congregation, and his inner circle of trusted lieutenants enforced his increasingly draconian edicts. Mackenzie instructed his followers to destroy all documents given by the government, including national IDs and birth certificates. The combined threat of wild animals and men with guns kept people confined to their homes, and they would only gather twice a month under a tree in their village to be led in prayer by their designated preacher. Mackenzie's word was law, and any perceived disloyalty was harshly punished. Mackenzie's doomsday revelation. The true depths of Mackenzie's malevolent designs were yet to be revealed. In early 2023, the self-proclaimed prophet claimed to have received a revelation from God during a 40-day fast in the wilderness. Doomsday was fast approaching, Mackenzie preached, and the only path to salvation was through starvation. He ordered his followers to follow a fasting schedule, starting with the children, single people, married women, and then married men, to intake no food or water, with the promise of meeting Jesus in the afterlife. Mackenzie and his family would go last. Mackenzie assured the faithful that their suffering would not only save their own souls, but serve as an atonement for the world's sins in the end times. He invoked the biblical motif of sacrifice and twisted it to his own dark ends. Some cult members, so thoroughly indoctrinated and cut off from reality, willingly embraced Mackenzie's apocalyptic vision. Parents watched their own children waste away, forbidden from intervening lest they interfere with the divine plan. As the death toll mounted, Mackenzie's deputies buried the bodies in shallow graves scattered throughout the forest. But even in the throes of starvation, survival instincts kicked in, and some followers managed to break free from Mackenzie's psychological grip. In March 2023, a small group of emaciated women and children emerged from the forest, seeking food and medical attention in nearby villages. Their shocking condition and stories of mass starvation quickly reached the authorities. The horrific discovery. On April 14th, a multi-agency team, including police, medics, and aid workers, entered the Shakahola forest on a rescue mission. What they encountered was a scene of unimaginable horror. Scattered among the 9 settlements were mass graves, some with the bodies of children still clinging to their deceased mothers. Survivors were little more than living skeletons. Over the following weeks, the scale of the atrocity came into focus. Forensic teams painstakingly exhumed 427 bodies in total, a somber procession of victims, men, women, and children who had starved to death or been strangled or bludgeoned by the cult enforcers. Over 600 people were still unaccounted for, likely buried in yet undiscovered graves. Aftermath and investigation. The horrific discovery of mass graves in the Shakahola forest sent shockwaves through Kenya and the international community. As authorities began to unravel the extent of the atrocities committed by Paul Mackenzie and the Good News International Church, the nation grappled with the difficult questions that arose in the wake of such a tragedy. Mackenzie and his associates were swiftly arrested, and the investigation into their activities began in earnest. The pastor, who had a history of radical preaching and run-ins with the law, now faced the most serious charges of his life. In December 2023, in a separate case, Mackenzie was sentenced to 18 months in prison by the Malindi court for illegally distributing films and operating a film studio without a valid license from the Kenya Film Classification Board. However, this conviction paled in comparison to the heinous crimes he was accused of in relation to the Shakahola cult massacre. As the investigation progressed, the extent of the psychological and physical abuse within the cult became increasingly clear. Mackenzie and dozens of his associates faced a litany of charges, including murder, terrorism, manslaughter, assault, radicalization, engaging in organized criminal activity, cruelty to a child, facilitating the commission of a terrorist act, and child torture. The evidence against them mounted, painting a picture of a cult leader who had wielded his influence to devastating effect. Despite the gravity of the accusations against him, Mackenzie remained defiant. He claimed that the starvation was God's will, and that the authorities were persecuting him for his faith. This stance only served to underscore the depth of his delusion and the extent to which he had manipulated his followers. In January 2024, the case against Mackenzie and his associates reached a critical point. Mackenzie and 94 others were charged with terrorism-related crimes in connection with the deaths of 429 followers. The scale of the tragedy was almost incomprehensible, and the nation struggled to come to terms with how such a thing could have happened. By February 2024, the focus of the investigation had turned to the most vulnerable victims of the cult's activities, the children. Mackenzie and 29 others were charged with the murder of 191 children found buried in the forest. The revelation that so many young lives had been lost sent a wave of grief and anger through the nation. As the investigation continued and more details emerged about the inner workings of the cult, the Kenyan government and public were forced to confront difficult questions. How had Mackenzie, a man with a documented history of dangerous radicalization, been allowed to operate unchecked for so long? Why did hundreds of people follow him into the wilderness to their doom? Investigators pointed to the desperate socioeconomic conditions in the region as a key factor in the tragedy. Mackenzie had preyed on the poor and uneducated, promising them divine salvation from their earthly misery. His message of a corrupt, doomed world had found fertile ground among those with little hope, and the cult had provided a sense of purpose and community, even as it destroyed them. Others highlighted the lax regulation of Kenya's mushrooming religious movements as a contributing factor. The rise of predatory figures like Mackenzie had been enabled by a system that struggled to balance religious freedom with the need to curb extremism. The tragedy in Shakahola had brought this issue into sharp focus, and there were calls for greater oversight of religious institutions, lessons, and reflections. As a shocked nation mourned the senseless loss of life in Shakahola, the government vowed reforms. President William Ruto established a task force to review the rules governing religious institutions. Prosecutors built a wide-ranging case against Mackenzie and his accomplices, aiming to secure justice for the hundreds of lives stolen. But for the survivors and the families of the deceased, the scars run deep. Parents bury children whose last moments were filled with confusion and agony. Widows and orphans piece together shattered lives, their loved ones stolen by a cruel lie. A community tries to fathom how their neighbors descended into such darkness. The Shakahola forest, once a place of unspeakable suffering, has become a somber memorial. Rows of simple wooden crosses mark the graves of the cult's victims, a testament to the lives cut short by one man's twisted vision. Mourners leave flowers and keepsakes, grasping for some way to process the incomprehensible. As the wheels of justice turn and the nation reflects, the story of the Shakahola cult massacre stands as a chilling reminder of the insidious power of religious extremism and reverence of cult figures. How an ideology in the wrong hands can lead the vulnerable down a path of destruction, and how eternal vigilance is the price of preventing such tragedies. The scars of Shakahola will linger long in Kenya's memory. But in the end, the truth prevailed over Mackenzie's web of deadly lies. The brave survivors who sounded the alarm, the dedicated rescuers who faced the horror head-on, and the investigators who untangled the cult's secrets are the guardians of light against the darkness. As the victims are laid to rest and the perpetrators face judgment, Kenya is left to ponder the hard lessons of the Shakahola tragedy. How to balance faith and freedom, community and individuality, hope and discernment. They are questions with no easy answers, but ones that demand attention lest the mistakes of the past be repeated. For the lives lost to the Shakahola cult, there is no true justice to be had. They cannot be brought back from the grave. But in their memory, in the tears shed for them, and the reforms enacted in their name, there is a chance for meaning to grow from the depths of meaningless suffering. A chance to build a world where the light of truth outshines the false prophets. As Kenya mourns and rebuilds, these are the values that light the way forward. The values that ensure the victims of Shakahola will never be forgotten, and their fate never repeated. We now turn to the unsolved case of the River Thames body. On September 25, 2001, IT consultant Aidan Minter was heading into town for a business meeting just like any other day. Little did he know that that day would be etched in his memory as a nightmare for years to come. As Aidan made his way across Tower Bridge into central London, he glanced towards the River Thames and noticed something floating. At first, it looked like a dummy, but as the tide brought the figure closer, he made a horrifying discovery. It was a human body. Aidan immediately called the police, who rushed to the scene and retrieved the dismembered body of a young dark-skinned male from the river. The police believed the body had been in the water for around 10 days, but his identity remained a mystery. Tests on the body revealing that he was between 4 and 7 years old at the time of death. The autopsy showed that the cause of death was a slit throat, and given the precision of the cuts to his head and limbs, he had been amputated expertly. Cough syrup was also found in the boy's system, raising several questions. Had he been drugged, Was he sick? Did this contribute to his death at all? With the body's identity still a mystery, the boy was dubbed Adam by the police. A £50,000 reward was offered for any valuable information that could lead to solving the crime. Despite efforts, nobody came forward with credible leads. The details of this murder case were chilling and immediately raised suspicions of a ritualistic killing. Experts concluded that it resembled muti killings seen in southern Africa, where traditional healers use body parts for various purposes like medicine or charms for wealthy individuals. Following this line of inquiry, the Metropolitan Police took their investigation to South Africa in an attempt to uncover the truth behind this gruesome crime. Former President Nelson Mandela even appealed to the South African citizens to come forward and assist the UK police in solving this mystery. Again, these efforts failed to yield any results, suggesting perhaps that this event wasn't specific to South Africa. It was soon established that the dismemberment was not consistent with the muti ritual killings, and further investigation would shift the police focus to the western part of the continent, as evidence would suggest the death was more in line with the depraved occurrences of human sacrifice reportedly practiced by some in Nigeria. Things were taking a dramatic turn. In July 2002, social workers in Glasgow grew concerned about the safety of two girls who were living with their mother, Joyce Osage. When council workers visited her home, they discovered what they considered strange ceremonial objects. During a court hearing to protect the children, Joyce shared a chilling story about cults, killings, and sacrifices. This caught the attention of an observant police officer who promptly contacted the homicide unit in London. DS Nick Chalmers then searched Joyce's home and made a shocking discovery. He found clothes with the same Kids and Company label, and in the exact sizes as Adam's orange shorts. This raised enough suspicion to justify Joyce's arrest. The officers were convinced Joyce was vital to the story, but she seemed confused, and her account kept changing. She insisted that she knew nothing about Adam, but couldn't explain the coincidence with the clothes. Without any evidence to charge her with a crime, she was eventually released, bringing investigators back to square one. A whole year passed after Adam's murder, and in September 2002, a memorial service was held at London's City Hall to honor Adam's life. It was a solemn and heartfelt gathering, with around 30 police officers, pathologists, and other experts involved in the case. Seeing people paying tribute to someone whose identity was still unknown was a beautiful display of empathy and honoring of a restless soul yet to receive justice. The Metropolitan Police did not give up, and more forensic work was done on Adam's DNA. In December 2022, it was confirmed that he did indeed have West African ancestry, specifically from a region around Benin City in southern Nigeria, which coincidentally is Joyce Osage's hometown. The pollen samples found in Adam's gut were also quite revealing. They indicated that Adam had only been in the southeast of England for a short period, possibly just days or weeks, before his tragic death. Furthermore, in Adam's stomach, the investigators found an unusual substance made of African river clay. It had vegetation, ground bone, and even traces of gold and quartz. The ash suggested the mixture had been burned before Adam ingested it. A month prior to these new DNA revelations, Joyce Osage ended up being deported after her asylum application was rejected. Detective Inspector Will O'Reilly and his boss, Nick Chalmers, accompanied her on a private jet to Nigeria. They were hoping that during the flight, she would open up and reveal crucial information about the murder. Unfortunately, she didn't say a word. The detectives didn't even step off the plane when they landed in Lagos, and after that, Joyce vanished into thin air. At the time of Osage's initial arrest, they discovered that she only had 2 contacts in her phone. One was a man named Moussa Kamara, who was traced to a house in London. When officers searched his house, they found some peculiar items: an animal skull punctured with a nail, liquid potions, and small packets containing what seemed to be sand or earth. They even came across a videotape labeled Rituals, which showed a drama involving an adult man being beheaded. These items appeared to be associated with rituals, popularly known as juju. Interestingly, the detectives figured out that Moussa Kamara's real name was Kingsley Ojo. However, since there wasn't substantial evidence directly linking him to Adam's murder, he was released on bail. The police had their suspicions about Ojo's involvement in human trafficking, so they decided to keep a close eye on him. Within hours of his release, he was in contact with criminal associates, organizing the illegal entry of Nigerians into the UK, and over time it became clear that he was a major player in this people smuggling operation and went by several aliases. In July 2003, after months of surveillance, the police carried out coordinated raids at 9 different addresses across London, arresting a total of 21 men and women, including Ojo himself. In July 2004, the police had gathered enough evidence to charge Kingsley Ojo for people smuggling and using fake documents, but nothing to do with Adam's death. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 4 years in jail and was recommended to be deported upon his release. However, detectives still held hope that Ojo might still hold crucial information about Adam's death. Interestingly, while in Brixton prison, Ojo gained a reputation as a big man. And it was even reported that he performed juju rituals in exchange for money on behalf of other prisoners. Now, remember the vegetation forensics had found in Adam's stomach? Well, in October 2003, on the request of the Metropolitan Police, botanists at Kew Gardens analyzed the plant remains found in Adam's gut, and their findings were mind-blowing. It turned out that Adam had ingested parts of 2 different plants. First, they found traces of the Calabar bean, also known as the doomsday or ordeal plant, used in certain spiritual ceremonies in West Africa. In small amounts, it causes paralysis, but doesn't numb pain. They also discovered ground-up seeds from the dachra plant, which acts as a sedative and causes hallucinations. Detectives believed that this concoction was given to Adam before his throat was cut. Horrifyingly, it would have left him paralyzed and helpless, but still aware of what was happening to him. In 2005, things seemed to take a positive turn when, while in prison, Kingsley Ojo reached out to the investigation team regarding Adam's death. He claimed to have secret recordings of Joyce Osajid, which his associates in Nigeria had made. Ojo expressed his desire to help track down the killer and clear his name. After his sentence ended, and while awaiting deportation, Ojo was interviewed by the officers. He managed to convince the murder team that he could be of assistance. By late 2005, he was released and back in East London, seemingly aiding the inquiry. For more than 2 years, Ojo provided information to the police. On one occasion, he claimed that Miss Osajid was returning to the UK, but it turned out to be false information. Additionally, he accused another woman of leading the sacrificial ceremony in September 2001. Detectives went as far as placing an undercover officer in her church for months, but ultimately concluded that there was no basis for the claims. Finally, in December 2006, 5 years after the tragic incident, Adam's body was laid to rest in a London cemetery in an unmarked grave. The service was attended by a few dedicated police officers, including DS Nick Chalmers and Will O'Reilly, who were there from the beginning. As for Kingsley Ojo, he ultimately proved to be unreliable. It turned out he was still using a false identity and involved in benefit fraud, even after his release from prison. In 2008, he was deported back to Nigeria. During his deportation hearing, Ojo claimed he had always done his best to aid the investigation. Meanwhile, Joyce Osajid reappeared in Nigeria and was interviewed by the police. She finally admitted to looking after Adam when she lived in Hamburg, Germany, and even confessed to buying the orange shorts found on his body. However, she didn't provide any further information and vanished once again. The mystery continued to deepen. After years of searching, The team finally found someone in Germany who knew Joyce. A social worker, Ria Mattens, met Joyce and her two girls in Hamburg. Most pivotally, she even remembered seeing Joyce with a young boy in the summer of 2001 who could have been Adam. According to Ria, the boy was timid and introverted. He would stay in one spot and not move around much. Joyce treated him as a necessary evil, dragging him along and not wanting to let him out of her sight. In 2011, the investigators made a surprising discovery. They found many photos among Joyce Osagid's belongings in Germany, and one featured a boy who looked around 5 years old. Detectives could not be certain that this was Adam, and as one might expect a decade on, a new team had taken over the case. The photo was publicized on ITV News, who also attempted to locate Joyce in Nigeria. When they managed to contact her, Joyce confirmed that the boy in the photo was Adam, and his real name was in fact Ikpamosa. She claimed to have cared for him for a period of time before giving him to someone named Bawa. After retiring from the Met, Nick Chalmers and the team traveled to Benin City in Nigeria to meet Joyce. They found her living in a small house in a run-down neighborhood. Although she seemed pleased to see them, she appeared confused at times and was apparently suffering from mental health problems. Here's where things get more complicated. Joyce completely backtracked on her previous claim and insisted that the boy in the photo, thought to be Adam, was a boy named Danny, who they were later able to track down in Hamburg, alive and well. But the most shocking revelation came when they showed Joyce another photo. She instantly recognized the man as Bawa, the person she claimed to have given Adam to in Germany in 2001. The photo turned out to be of trafficker Kingsley Ojo, firmly establishing their connection and his possible involvement. The team managed to track Ojo in Nigeria, but he refused to meet in person. However, he agreed to talk on the phone and adamantly denied any involvement in Adam's murder. Since 2013, the investigation into the mysterious murder of Adam has been classified as a cold case, with no significant leads having come forward. It also came to transpire that Joyce, perhaps the most crucial potential witness, had since passed away. Nobody involved in this chilling case left unscathed. Aidan Minter, the consultant who discovered Adam's body in the river, was diagnosed with acute post-traumatic stress disorder, and the case still haunts retired Detective Nick Chalmers. 23 years on, there is no closure, though a deeply sad conclusion can be made for certain. A family somewhere is missing a family member who was brutally murdered, mutilated, and dumped in a river thousands of miles away in London, and here his remains are buried. Whether justice will ever come to pass someday, one can only hope. In our next tale, we delve into the unsolved missing persons case, the McDonald's boys. Singapore, 1986. Best friends Kay Chin An and To Hong Huat, both 12 years old, began an ordinary walk to school together one sunny morning. Laughing lightheartedly, they planned to make a quick stop at the shops across the street before class. But the quick detour led them to an unthinkable tragedy that shook the nation for decades. By the end of this very day, the two innocent boys who left side by side, closest of companions, vanished without a trace, launching years of agonizing mystery. What happened to the McDonald's boys? Their puzzling disappearance ignited feverish public speculation, tormented their bereft families, and remained one of Singapore's most notorious unsolved crimes. The disappearance. Our tragic story begins on the afternoon of May 14, 1986. 12-year-old best friends Kay Chin An and To Hong Huat were last seen walking together towards Owen Primary School in Singapore after Chin An had stopped by Hong Huat's house to pick him up along the way. The two young boys, both wearing neat school uniforms, chatted happily with the innocence of youth as they headed to class. As they crossed the street nearing the school, adventurous Chin An told Hong Huat he wanted to quickly duck into the shops across the way first. Hong Huat nodded in agreement and continued the last stretch towards school. expecting his friend would catch up in no time. Upon arriving at school, Hong Huet set his bag down and waited eagerly for Chin An's return. Meanwhile, Chin An came back from his little detour and ran into his classmate Wang Piwei, who kindly offered to watch Chin An's school bag so he could keep his hands free for the shops. Chin An thanked Piwei and left his bag in his friend's safekeeping, telling Piwei he'd be back shortly to pick it up. But Chin An would never return to retrieve that book bag. And as afternoon classes started at 12:55 p.m., a worrying realization began dawning on the teachers that neither Chin An nor Hong Huet showed up. Marked absent from class, the last sighting of them had been at 12:30 p.m., before they effectively vanished without explanation or trace. Panic began setting in after school, as frantic calls were made summoning both boys' parents to urgent meetings with the principal. Wang Piwei relayed his last interaction with Chin An to the distressed families, hoping it might yield clues. The baffled parents pleaded desperately for any signs of their young son's whereabouts. But a quick neighborhood search that evening through the local estates would uncover nothing. In the days that followed, police intensely scoured all areas surrounding the school, putting up missing posters throughout Singapore begging citizens for help. But even as 100 people would eventually be interviewed over this mystifying case, not a single credible lead emerged. Nearly 3 months later, in August 1986, authorities received an anonymous tip that filled parents with momentary hope. Informants claimed Hong Huet and Chin An were positively identified on Pulau Ubin, a small island off the coast of Singapore. Officers painstakingly combed every last inch of that island's dense tropical landscape. But the exhaustive search only compounded the community's agony, finding no trace of the boys there, united in hope. Despite their own limited financial means, the grieving families of To Hong Huet and K Chin An first banded together to offer a small but meaningful reward of 1,000 Singapore dollars to anyone who could provide information about their missing sons. As months dragged on without answers, their desperation grew. In July 1986, just 2 months after the boys vanished, the families doubled the reward to $5,000, begging the public for help solving the baffling mystery. When this still failed to uncover substantial leads, the heartbroken parents pooled their meager resources again, just 2 months later in September, quadrupling the reward to $20,000 despite their poverty. They felt utterly helpless and were willing to sacrifice everything if it meant finding their lost children. In October 1986, hope arrived from an unexpected source. Moved by the plight of the families, McDonald's Singapore Managing Director Robert Kwan made a game-changing offer on behalf of the fast food giant. McDonald's would put up an incredible $100,000 reward for credible information to help resolve the case. McDonald's didn't stop there. They plastered the smiling faces of To Hong Huet and K Chin An on missing persons posters across hundreds of their restaurant outlets all over Singapore. For months, customers were greeted with the haunting stares of these lost boys begging to be found. The incredible reward money and publicity blitz led to renewed public intrigue and investigative leads. Tips poured in throughout late 1986 and 1987 as McDonald's used its immense influence to keep attention on solving this confounding mystery. Though the boys' fate remained unknown, the families finally felt like they had allies on their side. Search expands and leads run cold. By 1987, despite exhausting all efforts within Singapore's borders, the closest thing authorities had to leads were a few alleged sightings in neighboring countries. Expanding their search efforts internationally, police reached out to their regional counterparts in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand for assistance tracking down these latest scant breadcrumbs. But even enlisting the help of elite organization Interpol and casting the net widely in these nearby nations, the promising cross-border collaboration sadly yielded nothing substantive that could reunite this mystery with its long grieving parents. Then, in a moment of inspiration in November 1988, investigators turned to an emerging technological technique that would morph facial features to predict what young Chin An could look like 2 years on from the last known photo of him at just 12. Forensic artists generated an uncannily realistic image of their best projection, widely publicizing the new photo in hopes it may trigger recognition from witnesses who now knew better the proper age of one of these missing youths today. But despite the waves from this innovative attempt, Chin An's whereabouts remained an agonizing dead end. Hong Huat's determined mother Tan Jiok Kwan refused to surrender hope. In 1990, she proactively appealed to influential Malaysian officials to leverage their regional resources, investigating her son's baffling fate. While Malaysian authorities pledged their cooperation, analyzing leads across the border, once again, no meaningful progress ensued. In yet another creative attempt to spark public recollection in 1994, police used technology to render impressions envisioning how both Kay Chin An and To Hong Huat could appear now fully grown 20-year-old men, unrecognizable from childhood memory. Authorities circulated these speculative aged renderings widely, praying for the miracle of finally just one legitimate witness coming forward who may have seen these young men. But the now 8-year cold case seemed permanently frozen in elliptic mystery. Stunning accusation. Then in 1996, 12 painful years since the boys disappeared, a private investigator and ex-policeman named Henry Tay ignited explosive new public speculation by positing his own theory. Tay had thoroughly investigated Hong Huat's family history and suspected his long-estranged biological father To, who Don may have been involved with the baffling vanishing. It turned out Hong Huat was the product of an affair To had years prior. And while To deeply loved this illegitimate son, Hong Huat's birth mother gave him up for adoption to To's then-girlfriend Tan Jiok Kwan, the only mother Hong Huat would ever know. When To and Tan eventually married, then divorced, she forbid him any contact with his son, the boy To missed terribly. Tay hypothesized that To crossed paths with the children that fateful day in 1986. And with bitterness and mental instability from his broken life overwhelming him, To erupted, forcibly abducting his most prized person, the son denied him. One can only imagine young Chin An tragically getting caught up in the deranged chaos. This bombshell accusation led to immediate public outcry and police apprehending To as the prime suspect. However, after intense interrogation over a 24-hour period, To had to be released right back onto the streets. With still no shred of tangible evidence against him beyond speculation, tying him to the boy's grim vanishing. The last hope? Another dead end filled with fleeting euphoria gave way to sinking resignation that this terrible riddle may remain permanently unsolved. Until 14 restless years later in 2010, when authorities received an electrifying anonymous tip that whispered the first plausible account of the boy's final known moments. This latest informant confidently claimed to have witnessed frail young Hong Huat being forcefully snatched away against his cries and protests for help. He described seeing loyal Chin An desperately pleading with this threatening figure looming over them, demanding Hong Huat go with him. The terrified mystery witness then disturbingly recounted seeing this petrifying man boldly declaring to Chin An that he was Hong Huat's long-lost father. The caller ominously disclosed whispers, the boys may both still be alive somewhere remote, perhaps hidden prisoners abroad at the mercy of this volatile figure who feels entitled to his son. Could this finally be the break in the baffling 26-year-old ice-cold trail that leads to closure on what really happened that horrific spring day in 1986? Authorities urgently investigated the compelling account. But regretfully, yet again investigators struggled corroborating the gripping claims into substantiated breakthrough evidence. Lives left shattered. In the painful years that followed the inexplicable disappearance of To Hong Huat and Kay Chin An, both families understandably clung to the slim hope that their young sons might still be alive, somehow surviving against the odds. Hong Huat's mother Tan Jiok Kwan returned to Malaysia to await word, repeatedly reaching out to officials for updates on her son's case. In 1990, She pleaded with Datuk Seri Michael Chong, head of the Malaysian Chinese Association's Public Services and Complaints Department, to help investigate Hong Huat's fate. Despite his efforts, the trail had gone cold, and after several calls, Tan sadly did not follow up again. Her ultimate fate is unknown. Meanwhile, Chin An's family relocated from their Toa Payoh home, but returned regularly, hoping their boy found his way back. The disappearance devastated the family, especially K. Cheng Pan, Chin An's father. Constant concern for his missing son took a serious toll both physically and mentally. In later years, Mr. K suffered failing health, including stroke and dementia, before passing away a few years prior to 2020. According to Chin An's mother Tay Mi Na in a 2020 interview, she retreated from society for over 20 years, watching neighborhood children play while privately grieving. The tragedy created lasting rifts between the formerly close-knit families, according to residents. Though Tay began cautiously re-engaging her community in recent years, the pain of losing her son so young still weighed heavy after over 30 years. Both families bore unimaginable torment from the mysterious incident, clinging to fading hopes their boys would defy odds and return safely home one day. Though with each passing year, any trail that could solve this tragic mystery grew colder. Over 30 agonizing years later, since these beautiful boys vanished, seemingly no closer to resolution, our story fades to the final credits. With the hopes, prayers, and tears of two families suspended eternally frozen in this painful mystery locked in time. The haunting legend of the McDonald's boys' tragic disappearance remains forever imprinted as one of Singapore's most confounding unresolved crimes. Two bright young lives with so much promise ahead, inexplicably extinguished without explanation on that fateful day. We now turn to the deep underworld of Hong Kong, the horrific Hello Kitty murder. When struggling single mom Fan Man Yi stole 4,000 Hong Kong dollars from a ruthless gangster in 1999, she never imagined his cruel revenge would lead to her brutal torture and horrific death. The gang member and 3 accomplices subjected the vulnerable ex-prostitute to a month of merciless drug-fueled torture before mutilating and discarding her remains across the city, including stuffing her skull in a Hello Kitty mermaid doll. The shocking case existed within a crime wave of triad underworld violence, which ran rampant in Hong Kong through the 90s, but stood out for its uniquely depraved and gruesome details. Fan Man Yi was born in 1976 in Shenzhen, China. She was tragically abandoned by her family as a small child, leaving Fan to grow up all alone in a Hong Kong orphanage for girls. The orphanage maintained a strict age limit, forcing residents to leave at 15 years old. With no known family or caregivers to take her in, Fan Man Yi was left homeless on the dangerous streets of Hong Kong. In the harsh environment, she soon developed a drug habit, and with limited prospects, turned to prostitution as a means of survival. At age 21, after several years on the streets, Fan got an indoor job at a Hong Kong brothel called Romance Villa, located in the crowded neighborhood of Sham Shui Po. At the brothel, she met client Ng Kai Yuan, himself a drug addict. Despite both struggling with substance abuse issues, Ng and Fan married each other the same year, perhaps finding some semblance of connection after lives filled with abandonment and trauma. In 1998, Fan gave birth to a son. For the first time in her traumatic life, she felt real, unconditional love as a mother. Fan, her husband Ng, and the new baby lived together in a tiny, crowded apartment in Hong Kong's Mong Kok neighborhood. But their home was far from a happy family environment. Ng had a violent temper and would regularly beat Fan in drunken rages. Police were called numerous times to the household for domestic disputes, and neighbors often overheard Fan's baby frantically screaming and crying amidst loud fights between the troubled couple. The difficult birth and toxic home environment of her infant son was a wake-up call for Fan. With a child depending on her now, she realized she desperately needed to turn her life around in order to protect her baby. Bravely, Fan managed to overcome her drug addiction and leave prostitution for good. She found lawful work as a hostess at a local nightclub called Empress Karaoke Club. In an act of defiant courage to shield her infant from harm, Fan even worked up the nerve to leave her abusive husband Ng. Without income from sex work, Fan struggled to earn enough to support herself and her son. As a single mother with only a modest income to survive on, they tightly straddled the line of poverty, but Fan focused on giving him the loving childhood she never had. In early 1999, whilst Fan struggled to adjust to her new circumstances, she made a big mistake that would ultimately cost her her life. The nightclub she worked at often catered to members of the Chinese mafia. On one of her shifts, she stole the wallet of one of her clients, who she had become acquainted with during his frequent visits. The wallet contained about 4,000 Hong Kong dollars, around 500 American dollars at the time. The owner of the wallet was Chan Man Lok, a fearsome Wo Shing Wo Triad gang member, well known for criminal behavior including drug trafficking. When Chan found out Fan had stolen from him, he became extremely angry. He demanded that Fan return his money immediately, but as punishment for stealing, he also expected an additional 10,000 Hong Kong dollar penalty by a swift deadline. Fan was very scared of Chan's gang connections. She quickly returned the full amount she stole, but pleaded for more time to secure the additional fee. For a single mother with no support network to come up with such an amount was near enough impossible. After all, it was financial turmoil that drove her to steal in the first place. Chan made little consideration for Fan's dire state. His patience wore thin, and he planned his cruel revenge. On March 17, 1999, Chan organized the kidnapping of Fan from her home in the Fu Yu section of Lai Yu Estate, a large public housing complex in the city. He enlisted 3 accomplices: 14-year-old Lau Mingfong, a troubled teen he had groomed into crime; 21-year-old Lung Wai Lun, a retail worker loyal to Chan; and 26-year-old Lung Xingqiu. The 4 kidnappers imprisoned Fan for a month in an apartment Chan rented at 31 Granville Road. Initially, Chan intended to exploit Fan to pay off her debt, but what occurred was an evil difficult to comprehend. During crystal meth binges, Chan and his accomplices put Fan through a horrific series of ordeals. They inflicted burns on her hands and legs with wax and hot plastic to the extent that she couldn't walk. They regularly beat her with metal bars, at times hanging her up and using her body as a human punching bag. The brutal torture and humiliation that Fan endured knew no bounds. In a ghastly display of depravity, she was forced to ingest urine and feces. When in the extremes of agony, the assailants ordered the helpless Fan to smile and pretend to enjoy her torture at the threat of more severe treatment. Fan's body finally surrendered. She died on April 14th or 15th, 1999 from the horrific injuries and traumatic shock from the sexual, physical, and psychological torture. After realizing Fan's body laying lifeless on the bathroom floor, the group debated what course of action to take. Failing to reach an agreement, the group went to play video games at a nearby arcade, leaving Fan's body in the apartment until the following day. Whilst high on meth, Chan made the decisive action to get rid of the evidence, ordering his men to dismember the body using a saw. They cut off her head and boiled the remains into soup. In a final cruel act, they stuffed Fan's severed skull inside a Hello Kitty doll. Her mutilated body parts were discarded in dumps around Hong Kong, with her headless corpse left in a trash bin. For several weeks, time went by with nobody outside of the group aware of the sadistic crime that had taken place. It was not until May 24, 1999, that a glint of justice came to light. Riddled by guilt and claiming to be haunted by the ghost of Fan, the 14-year-old accomplice, Lau, confessed to the police the horrid crimes she and her group had committed. The police were initially hesitant to believe her report. Lau had come into the station without guardians present, and in a visibly frantic state. It would have been easy to dismiss her as a child having an exaggerated nightmare. Nonetheless, they agreed to follow her direction as she led them to the Granville Road apartment, where police recovered a plastic bag at the scene containing Fan's skull, tooth, and internal organs. More remains were later found discarded in several dumps around the city. Lau's confession finally exposed the horrific torture and murder of Fan Man Yi, a vulnerable woman punished by a ruthless triad for a minor theft. Chan was arrested on May 28th in a raid on his home, where he had been living with his wife and newborn baby. Chan's wife was also apprehended and questioned by police, but shortly released due to lack of evidence of her involvement. Accomplice Leung Wai Lun became aware that the murder had made it to local media and tried to evade capture by fleeing to mainland China. But in February 2000, passport irregularities led to his arrest. He was extradited back to Hong Kong to face trial for his role. Chan and his henchmen, including 14-year-old Lau, were finally charged with murder, dismemberment, and corpse disposal of Fan Man Yi. With the whole group in custody, justice moved forward. On June 3, 1999, investigators positively identified Fan's skull using photographic matching. After the trial, the skull was kept in police custody as evidence until several years later, when Fan's family requested it be burned. With conclusive forensic proof that the skull belonged to Fan, prosecutors built a solid case against Chan and his accomplices. The trial began October 20, 2000. On December 7th, the jury returned a controversial verdict: manslaughter, not murder, due to lack of physical evidence on the decayed remains. The jury could not definitively prove the nature of Fan's death, and given her history of addiction, whether it was by murder or drug-induced. Nonetheless, the court recognized Chan and his accomplices' culpability in Fan's death through torture, and as part of an immunity deal, Lau testified against the others. The trial became a media sensation, with the public receiving harrowing insights into the gruesome nature of the events directly from the culprits. Justice Peter Nguyen condemned the three men for their horrific cruelty and lack of regret, sentencing each to life imprisonment with no chance of parole for 20 years. Chan lost his 2007 appeal to reduce his life sentence. But in March 2004, Leung Shing-cho managed to get his sentence reduced to 18 years through an appeal. Leung was released back into society in April 2014. This foray into freedom was short-lived. In August 2022, Leung Shing-cho was arrested again for sexually assaulting a 10-year-old girl. The repeated offender was sentenced to another 12 months in prison. Meanwhile, the Granville Road apartment building where Fan met her untimely demise was demolished in 2012 and rebuilt as Hotel Sorvit in 2016. 3 Buddha statues sit in the building to honor her memory. Still, a question remains. What became of the young infant, Fan's son, who inspired her to seek a positive life? Little is known of this mystery. A necklace, Fan's only recovered possession, was found at the crime scene by police and given to him. There were suspicions that Fan's son, an ex-husband, NG, moved to Singapore shortly following her murder. The mementos and scattered rumors are all that remain of Fan beyond the memorial statues, haunting case details, and legacy of one of the world's most senseless, brutal displays of evil. Fan's life was hard and abusive from the start. Though she made mistakes, Fan worked hard to make a loving home for her son. Chan and his gang took Fan's life in a fashion that blurs the line between what one could expect from horrific fiction writing and reality. It was evident that to the perpetrators, and perhaps society at large, that her life held no measure of value. The tragic death of Fan Man Yi at the hands of a ruthless triad gang exposes how the most vulnerable in society often suffer the worst brutality, and how difficult it is to escape the callous nature of the underworld, even when you have the best of intentions to start anew. In our final case, we uncover the horror of the Tot family massacre. The holidays are meant to be a time of joy and togetherness. But in 2019, something went horribly wrong for the Tot family in the picturesque community of Celebration, Florida. After weeks of no contact, police entered their home in January 2020 to discover a gruesome scene: the bodies of mom Megan, children Alec, Tyler, and Zoe, and their dog, all murdered. The only survivor was the father, Anthony Tot, who had been living with the corpses. This is the tragic story of the Tot family murders. By all appearances, the Tots were a picture-perfect family chasing the American dream. Anthony Tot was a successful physical therapist. His wife Megan stayed home with their 3 children: 13-year-old Alec, 11-year-old Tyler, and 4-year-old Zoe. After living in Connecticut for many years, the family relocated to Celebration, Florida, a charming town developed by Disney. They settled into a spacious rental home on Reserve Place in 2017. Friends and neighbors knew the Tots as a tight-knit, loving bunch. The kids were polite and talented, excelling in school and music. Alec played the piano, while Tyler and Zoe took dance classes. Megan was a devoted mother, shuffling the kids to activities and supporting their hobbies. Anthony was an involved dad, coaching the boys' soccer teams and volunteering with special needs children. The family frequented Disney World and had annual passes. From the outside, their life looked idyllic. But behind the happy facade, the Tots were slowly crumbling. Megan battled health issues, getting diagnosed with Lyme disease in 2017 after a tick bite. The illness sapped her physically and mentally. Once an outgoing, active mom, she grew more withdrawn and struggled with depression. Anthony was dealing with his own demons. His physical therapy practice in Connecticut, which he commuted to weekly, was floundering. Unbeknownst to the family, he had started inflating bills and charging insurance for treatments patients never received, trying to keep the business afloat and fund their lifestyle. Cracks in the foundation. The Tots' picture-perfect life began to crumble in 2019. Megan's health worsened. Meanwhile, Anthony's fraud scheme caught up with him. His Connecticut practice was shuttered, and he found himself hundreds of thousands in debt, drowning in lawsuits and threats of losing his license. The pressure took a toll on the family. Once fixtures in the Celebration community, they pulled away, no longer attending town events or chatting with neighbors. When school started in the fall, Megan didn't sign the kids up, telling people they would stay in Florida for homeschooling. It was out of character for the education-focused mom. Relatives also noticed the normally responsive Tots weren't returning calls or messages. When they did reply, their texts were short and strange, uncharacteristic of their usual communication style. As the holidays approached, there was radio silence from the Tots. Megan's family in Pennsylvania hadn't heard from her since before Thanksgiving. They left voicemails, sent emails, but got no response. Gifts they mailed to the kids in early December sat untouched. They contacted the sheriff's office in Florida, requesting a welfare check. Deputies went to 202 Reserve Place on December 29th, but reported back that they didn't see anything suspicious. They couldn't enter the home without cause. But in Connecticut, there was an unsettling development. A federal arrest warrant had been issued for Anthony Tot. The healthcare fraud allegations had escalated into serious charges. Agents notified local authorities in Florida, and on the morning of January 13th, they converged on the Tot home, hoping to take Anthony into custody. A house of horror. The scene that greeted agents and deputies at 202 Reserve Place was unlike anything they'd witnessed. From outside, the 2-story house looked pristine, its white picket fence gleaming in the winter sun. But inside was a house of horror. A pungent smell of decomposition permeated the rooms. In the master bedroom, they discovered Megan, lifeless in her bed, a rosary clasped in her hand. The bodies of 11-year-old Tyler and 4-year-old Zoe were in their beds as well, decomposed beyond recognition. 13-year-old Alec was found on the floor nearby. They had been dead for weeks. In the midst of this gruesome scene was Anthony Tott, the only family member still alive. He was incoherent and lethargic, having consumed a massive amount of Benadryl in an apparent suicide attempt. It was clear he had been living with the corpses of his wife and children, even sleeping in the same room. Investigators also discovered the remains of the family's dog, Breezy, curled up in her bed. The news of the murders sent shockwaves through Celebration and beyond. The brutal killings stood in stark contrast to the town's carefully curated image of idyllic family life. Neighbors reeled with the realization that they'd been living next to a house of death, while relatives grappled with the unthinkable loss. How could a father wipe out his entire family in such a violent way? What darkness had overtaken this once happy home? A troubled past. As investigators get into Anthony Tott's background, a picture emerged of a man with a troubled history. Born in 1975, Anthony grew up in a tumultuous household. When he was just 4 years old, his father was arrested for a shocking crime, hiring a hitman to kill Anthony's mother. The assassination plot was unsuccessful, but Anthony witnessed the violence, an early trauma that experts say could have planted the seeds for future dysfunction. Despite this rough start, Anthony seemingly defied the odds. He became a successful physical therapist, married his college sweetheart Megan, and started a family. They settled in Connecticut, built a thriving practice, and had 3 children. Friends described them as loving and involved parents. Anthony appeared to be the quintessential family man, but the cracks were always there beneath the surface. Anthony confessed to struggling with depression and thoughts of self-harm from a young age. As an adult, he masked his mental health issues, presenting a happy face to the world. But inside, he felt like a failure, terrified of losing the perfect life he had built. The fraud at his practice started small, an inflated bill here, an extra charge there. But soon it snowballed into a massive scheme, with Anthony stealing tens of thousands from insurance companies to keep up appearances and please his family. When the house of cards finally collapsed in 2019, something in Anthony seemed to snap. Saddled with insurmountable debt, his license in jeopardy, perhaps he decided that if he couldn't provide the life his family wanted, they were better off dead. In his disturbed mind, family annihilation became preferable to facing consequences for his actions. A senseless act. The exact timeline and nature of the murders remained hazy, complicated by Anthony's shifting stories. At first, he claimed to have no memory of what transpired, even suggesting Megan was the killer. But physical evidence and expert analysis told a different tale. Investigators determined the family was massacred in mid-December, with Megan and the children being drugged with Benadryl before they were stabbed and suffocated. In his confession, Tott claimed he and his wife talked to the children about dying, and said the kids told them, "We want to die with you," the Sentinel reports. This chilling detail suggests that the entire family was involved in a murder-suicide pact, with the children allegedly agreeing to die alongside their parents. However, the veracity of this claim is questionable, given Anthony's history of shifting narratives and the physical evidence pointing to him as the sole perpetrator. The viciousness of the act defied comprehension. Anthony used a kitchen knife on his wife and children. He placed crosses in their hands after they died, a perverse religious gesture. But he spared himself, making only a weak attempt at overdosing. For weeks, he carried on living in the house, celebrating Christmas and New Year's, acting as if everything was fine while his family lay dead around him. In the end, it was Anthony's own sloppiness that ended the charade. He used the family's phones to send strange texts to relatives, raising red flags. He ignored mail piling up and missed rent payments, drawing the attention of neighbors and the homeowner. If he hadn't been arrested for fraud, there was no telling how long he would have continued living in that house of horror, facing justice. After his dramatic capture, Anthony Tott was charged with 4 counts of homicide and 1 count of animal cruelty for killing the family dog. The case made national headlines, drawing comparisons to other infamous family murderers like Chris Watts. In April 2022, after lengthy delays due to the pandemic, Todd's trial finally began in Osceola County. In court, prosecutors painted a picture of a selfish, evil man who slaughtered his family to escape the consequences of his own misdeeds. They highlighted his inconsistent stories, his lack of remorse, and the brutality he unleashed on his loved ones. Anthony's defense team tried to argue that Megan was the real killer, and that he merely helped cover up the crime, but jurors didn't buy it. After a wrenching trial, Anthony Todd was found guilty on all counts. At his sentencing hearing, he finally broke down, offering a rambling apology and saying he wished it had been him instead of his family. But the judge was unmoved, calling Todd a destroyer of worlds who had shattered multiple lives. In a rare move, he tacked on an additional year to Anthony's life sentence for the animal cruelty charge, declaring that the dog's life was no less valuable. A community shattered. The Todd family murders left an indelible mark on the town of Celebration. The master-planned utopia, designed by Disney to embody old-fashioned family values, had become the site of an unthinkable atrocity. Neighbors were left reeling, wondering how such evil could happen in their idyllic community. Parents struggled to explain the tragedy to their children, who had played with the Todd kids. In the months and years that followed, the people of Celebration came together to honor Megan, Alec, Tyler, and Zoe. Candlelight vigils were held, and a memorial garden was planted in their memory. The high school where Alec would have attended created a scholarship in his name. Tyler and Zoe's dance studio held a benefit recital. There was an outpouring of love and grief for the family that was taken too soon. But even as the community mourned, there was an undercurrent of anger and betrayal. How could a father who seemed so devoted turn on his own flesh and blood? What signs had they missed that the Todds were in trouble? Some blamed Anthony's fraud, saying the pressures of white-collar crime had pushed him over the edge. Others pointed to Megan's mental health struggles, wondering if her husband had snapped under the strain of caretaking. But in the end, there were no easy answers. Lessons learned. If there is anything to be gleaned from the senseless tragedy of the Todd murders, it's the importance of looking beneath the surface. The Todds were the quintessential, perfect family, attractive, successful, involved in their community. But behind closed doors, they were crumbling under the weight of secrets, lies, and untreated mental illness. Perhaps if Anthony had been honest about his financial troubles, or Megan had gotten help for her depression, their story would have had a different ending. The case is also a sobering reminder that violence can happen anywhere, even in the most picture-perfect of places. The town of Celebration was custom-built to be a haven for families, a throwback to a simpler time. But evil can take root even in the sunniest of spots. The Todd murders shattered the illusion that any community is immune to darkness. Ultimately, the legacy of the Todd family is one of squandered potential and senseless loss. Megan, Alec, Tyler, and Zoe had their whole lives ahead of them. They should have grown up, pursued their passions, started families of their own. Instead, they became statistics, their bright lights snuffed out by the man who should have protected them at all costs. The fact that even the family dog wasn't spared speaks to the depths of Anthony's depravity. This was Agent Magpie. And remember guys, be good. And if you can't be good, be careful.